Welcome everybody to the USC Price School Urban Growth Seminar. We've got our speaker today is Robert Poole. He'll be talking about Rethinking America's Highways, a vision for a better 21st century infrastructure, which also happens to be a book that he recently had published. I've got a copy on my coffee table and I'm reading it with a couple of other books, and it's very good. Basic synopsis is, in Rethinking America's Highways, Robert Poole examines how our current model of state-owned highways came about and why it is failing to satisfy its customers. He argues for a new model that treats highways themselves as public utilities, like electricity, telephones, and water supply. If highways were provided commercially, Poole argues, people would pay for highways based on how much they used, and the companies would issue revenue bonds to invest in facilities people were willing to pay for. Arguing for highway investments to be motivated by economic rather than political factors, this talk makes a carefully reasoned and well-documented case for a new approach to highways. Bob's co-founder of the Reason Foundation with Manny, Klausner, and Tibor Machan in 1978, and served as its president and CEO from then until 2000. He was a member of the Bush-Cheney transition team in 2000. Over the years, he's advised the Reagan, Clinton, and both Bush administrations on privatization and transportation policy. He's written hundreds of articles, papers, and policy studies on privatization and transportation issues, a couple of them with me, for which I thank him. He always improves the quality of my work. His popular writings have appeared in national magazines, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Forbes, and numerous other publications. And there's more. No. He's traveled from Florida to see us, so I figure he gets the entire introduction. He's presently Director of Transportation Policy and the Cyril Freedom Trust Transportation Fellow at the Reason Foundation. He's advised the U.S. DOT and half a dozen state DOTs on transportation policies. Over the past 20 years, he has helped introduce a number of policy ideas into U.S. transportation, including long-term toll concessions, HOT lanes, that's high-occupancy toll lanes, and truck-only toll lanes. A Reason policy paper Bob wrote in 1988 directly inspired the first public policy partnership law enacted in California in 1989. That law led directly to the SR 91 express lanes out in Anaheim Hills, the first all-electronic toll road, and the first U.S. long-term toll concession project. He received his BS and MS in mechanical engineering at MIT and did graduate work in operations research at NYU. Was that Stern? Was my guess?
No, it was before Stern.
Before Stern.
Yeah.
All right, pre-Stern.
Pre-Stern.
He's a member of the Transportation Research Board's Managed Lanes Committee and was a member of TRB's Special Committee on the long-term viability of fuel taxes for highway funding. In 2007, he was named Private Sector Entrepreneur of the Year by the Public-Private Partnerships Division of ARTBA. And in 2008, he was a member of the Texas Study Committee on Private Participation in Toll Projects. In 2010, he was a member of Washington State DOT's Expert Review Panel on the I-405 corridor. If you think R-405 is bad, you should go to Washington State.
But it's better now.
It's better now.
Express toll lanes in operation.
Thanks to your good work. And was a member of the Transportation Transition Team for Florida Governor Rick Scott. Bob produces Reason's monthly e-newsletter, Surface Transportation Innovations, and writes a monthly column on transportation policy for public works financing. His book is what he will talk about today. Every time I get a call from a reporter asking me a transportation question I don't know anything about, and that's pretty frequently, I will go to my inventory of Bob's e-newsletters, and I will Google the subject, or I'll search the subject, and up will come something. And I will read it, and I'll read whatever links he points to, and then I will call the reporter back, and the reporter doesn't know the difference. So I'm really grateful for all the help that you have given me.
Thank you, Jim.
All right, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Bob Poole.
Thanks, Jim, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I hope to get you to think a little outside the box today about transportation in America, particularly highway transportation. I've been doing transportation policy for 30 years, full-time for 20 years. And when I started out, I was perplexed by major problems with the highway system. Chronic congestion, which everybody in Los Angeles lives with that every day. I lived here for 20 years. Ongoing problems of deferred maintenance, which is a major unresolved problem. a large and growing backlog of major projects that would make a big difference but are not getting funded and implemented. A lot of times costs of projects significantly exceeding their benefits. And as you know, in California, with a measure on the ballot next week to repeal the big increase in gas taxes from a year ago, gas taxes have become to many people, some maybe a majority in California, just another tax to oppose, instead of the basic user fee that we depend on. And that's a political problem, and it's a serious problem for the highways of the future. Congestion. These numbers are about 4 years out of date, and they understate the problem. These are from the Texas Transportation Institute. But you see in Los Angeles, the cost to the average commuter every year, just in wasted time and excess fuel burn, is over $1,700. Now, INRIX, the big data firm, has started doing these studies on a worldwide basis. They do about 200 or 300 major urban areas around the world. LA is in the top 5 of that. I think it's second in the world in the worst congestion. And their numbers are about 40% higher than these. Now, they use much finer data collected through GPS and cell phones and so forth. So I think their data are more reliable. They're also more current than these. But these are the numbers in the book, and it's bad enough. Potholes. A group that I know, the Road Information Project, TRIP, every 2 years does a study using a reputable transportation model that estimates the increased depreciation and increased out-of-pocket repair and maintenance costs due to roads that are in poor condition. And these are the numbers. The latest thing just came out a few weeks ago, so I updated the numbers from the book. And here in Los Angeles, the average driver experiences an economic cost of $983 a year due to lousy roads. Why do we put up with this? I think we have an institutional problem. Deficient bridges. Now, this is a problem that varies greatly by state. You can see the worst 4 states there. So you've only got a few that are really bad, but 20 and 25% of bridges being deficient really should not be acceptable. I mean, these are many of them are structurally deficient, and therefore they get weight limited after a certain point. They can't take trucks. And this disrupts transportation. Now, in California, here are some overall measures of in this state. This comes every year. Reason Foundation for 23 years has been doing an annual report, state by state, on the conditions and performance of highways, using all data that each state DOT submits to Federal Highway Administration. So it's in a standardized format. It's only as good as the state DOT is reporting, but at least it's in a standardized format. So California, and we have a scoring system that people often dispute. People get high scores, love it. People get low scores, they go, oh, your methodology is all wrong. So we're continually trying to revamp the methodology and make it more fair. But California ranks 42 out of 50 states, down toward the bottom end of the league. By our ranking, the condition of interstates in California is 33rd, so in the bottom half also. Urban area congestion is second worst, according to these numbers, with, I think, Washington, D.C. at the time these were done, being in first place, but San Francisco often very much up there as well. And deficient bridges, California is 28th, so just barely in the bottom half. So not among the worst, well, not among the best, by sure, but not anywhere near down toward the tail end. So what are the underlying causes? I mean, you folks know things about transportation. I've spent many, many years on the subject. Well, we know congestion could be fixed by pricing. We're seeing it at work on the express toll lanes, like the SR91 and the new ones on I-10 and 110 and so forth. And there's 42 of these projects in operation around the country. Every single one of them is relieving congestion every day by variable pricing that actually works. But lack of pricing in general on our freeways, we're not anywhere near to solving the problem. Deferred maintenance has, I see, 2 causes. One is traditional procurement in the public sector, started in the progressive era as a reform measure, is based on the lowest bid for the construction costs. Well, that was designed, the state DOT comes up with the design. Everybody bids to exactly the same design, and the lowest price wins. Well, that seems fair, except the lowest initial cost is not the lowest life cycle cost. It often means cheap design that wears out much sooner, needs a lot more maintenance over its life, has to be rebuilt sooner. So we build in a problem of maintenance, that more maintenance than needed. But the other problem is political. When the state legislature meets to decide on the transportation budget, every member of the legislature wants to deliver projects in his or her district, to cut a ribbon and say, look what I brought you. So they tend to overemphasize capital spending. And what's left over is the money that they allocate, that Caltrans here in California can spend on maintenance. And so you end up, maintenance gets the short end of the stick, when it probably ought to get first consideration, because you got to preserve what you've got before you go building new things. So the priorities are backwards. The backlog, I mean, a big part of the problem of not enough capacity and not replacing bridges, that so forth, is because most of these things, if they're large projects, are paid for cash as you go, out of the annual budget. Well, you look at other major utilities, they finance, by issuing revenue bonds, big projects so that people pay for them over their useful life as they enjoy the benefits of those projects. They don't try to build everything out of annual cash flow, or they would, it would take 20 years to build a new electricity generating plant, as opposed to getting it done in just a few years that it actually takes to construct it. Politics versus economics leads to boondoggles, leads to projects that are politically attractive, but that don't pass even a basic benefit cost ratio of 1.0 or greater. And in some countries, like New Zealand, the last I knew, requires a 2.0 benefit cost ratio for any sort of major infrastructure project. I mean, that's pretty stringent, because they say there's nowhere near enough resources, so we've got to make sure that the resources that we spend are spent on the highest value project. We don't do that to any significant extent in this country. And the fuel tax battle that I talked about, that's writ large in California, this week going into next Tuesday, it's a big problem that we're not going to fix these problems without fixing the problem of funding. But the answer, all the traditional highway groups would say, oh, all we need to do is fix the funding and everything else gets solved. But all these other problems would not be fixed by just more funding. So a better system, in my view, would use pricing to manage traffic. It would go after the underlying causes, charge customers for what they use. They use more, they pay more. They use less, blah, blah. Select projects that have to have a positive benefit cost ratio and ideally a return on investment measured in commercial terms. Would minimize life cycle costs instead of just first cost. And so you make productive, wise investments instead of penny wise and pound foolish investments. And would finance major projects using revenue bonds the way we do in other areas of infrastructure. Now, what I've just described to you is a public utility. If you look around, think of the bills that you pay for electricity, telephones, natural gas, if you have gas service, cable, satellite, water supply. In all of these cases, you pay for exactly what you use. You know what you're paying. It's transparent. It's not hidden with some money coming from here, some money coming from there. And the average person has no idea what they pay for highways. I don't think it's in this presentation, but no, I have in a presentation aimed at lay people, not transportation people. I actually and the numbers are in the book, the average household bill for each of those utilities, and then I come up with the national average of what people pay in federal fuel taxes plus the average state fuel tax, and that works out to $44 a month. How many of your utility bills, your cell phone bill, any of these things are in that magnitude as opposed to a lot more? People have no idea how little they're paying, but that's because the system is not at all transparent. And so they finance their projects based on revenue streams coming from the customers. The bond market loves these things. The projects have to show a return on investment, or the bond market, they won't buy them. And maintenance is essential. What if your cell phone crapped out every fifth call? You wouldn't stand for that. This is nonsense. But the freeways crap out every day, and we just say, well, that's the way it is with freeways. This is nonsense. So the idea came to me about 15 years ago. What if we reorganized highways, major highways, not streets and roads, but major like freeways and interstates and so forth, as commercial enterprises. Now, these would not necessarily be privatized. For example, here in Los Angeles, the Department of Water and Power is a municipal utility. It provides electricity and water. But you pay a bill to them for electricity and water. You don't pay a tax to the city council that gets divvied up politically. So it runs as a business, even though it's a government business. And in the highway area, we do have several hundred state and municipal toll agencies that are financed. You pay directly. People know exactly what they're paying. They issue revenue bonds to build new facilities they have properly maintained and so forth. So this is not a private versus public per se. It's a different organizational design and a different relationship between the users or customers and the provider. We don't, well, let me get ahead of myself. These utilities have the ability to add capacity when and where it's needed. They decide their projects based on return on investment. And very interesting thing that I discovered in working with state DOTs and being on the Transportation Research Board Committee and so forth, in the whole transportation field, the people that are out there driving on the freeways or driving anywhere are called users. In all these other utilities, people are called customers. Now, one exception to that is the toll road agencies. Those have customers, and they treat them like customers. But in the highway sector, who is the customer of Caltrans? Where do they get their money, and who do they have to satisfy? Not the poor saps out there driving on the roads. It's the legislature. De facto, the legislature is the customer of the state DOT, and that's who they have to satisfy. Now, to me, that says what the system is. Even though some people in transportation are starting to say, oh, well, highways are a basic utility, they don't have any clue what they're talking about. I mean, you can use that name, but unless it has the substance, it's a joke. So now, what I try to do in the book is to say this is not necessarily a pipe dream. I mean, this would be a huge transition. It could not happen overnight, certainly, but it's not a pipe dream. There's a long history that I summarize in the book of private turnpikes in the UK and in the United States prior to the paved road automobile era. They were successful for a good while. Eventually, in the United States, they mostly went bankrupt due to first canals and then railroads. Canals were cheaper for freight, and railroads were much faster for people than the private turnpikes with horse-drawn wagons. So they eventually got competed out of existence. But in Europe, I discovered this when I first moved to California in the early 1970s from a guy at Caltrans, of all people, that in France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, most of what is their equivalent of our interstate highway system is tolled motorways that were initially developed mostly by state-owned toll agencies. All those were privatized in around 1999 through 2001, and those individual roads, links in the network, became individual, what they call concession agreements. So those privatized companies now have 20, 30, whatever the length of time they negotiated for each of the links in the network, and they're responsible for financing, managing, operating. But at the end of that expiration period of the concession, then the government can go out to bid and say, all right, well, they can negotiate with the existing concession holder. They can put it out to bid for somebody new to come in. Or they can take it over and run it themselves if they want to. And that politics sometimes changes in Europe. And some of them in Spain and Portugal have gone back and forth between the state and private over periods of time. But there's a long history and a lot of things we can learn from the European experience. That same basic model of investor-financed companies under these long-term kinds of agreements spread in the early 2000s, this century, to much of Latin America, all the major countries, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, more recently Colombia, Mexico, all have now a large fraction of their major highways are done by these investor-owned companies on long-term, what we would call franchises in the United States. And it's also in Australia. Basically, all of what we would call freeways in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, the three major metro areas, are investor-owned companies on these long-term agreements, operating them under public supervision. So this is a model that we can learn a lot from. It's getting all over the world. And the United States has done some on this. These are a few examples with 91 express lanes that I helped give birth to. In Orange County was the very first one privately financed under this kind of a deal here in California. And there are now a lot of these. Those are just a few examples. There's another table later on. Now, what these are, again, is they're long-term public-private partnerships. You have a competition to select the best qualified team to design, finance, build, operate, and maintain a facility, or to take over an existing one and modernize it, maybe rebuild it, and so forth, for a period ranging between typically 35 to 70 years, depending on the complexity of the project, how difficult it is to finance, and so forth. Now, the interesting thing that hardly anybody else has realized is that this model is very, very similar to what we know as electric utility franchises. Southern California Edison, I don't know what its current franchise situation is, but most electric utilities, investor-owned electric utilities in the United States, operate on a long-term franchise between 50 and 99 years, just like the toll things in Europe and in Latin America now and in Australia. So there is an example. They are not perpetual monopolies. They're time limited and under public supervision, regulatory oversight. They're financed by, so these highway ones are financed by debt and equity, because the private sector will invest equity like the down payment on your home is equity and the rest is a mortgage, that's the debt part. So the private sector puts in equity and then issues toll revenue bonds, typically 30 to 40 years for the majority of the financing to do the project. There's a lot of risk transfer because these things typically are suited to mega projects, billion-dollar scale projects. There's a lot of literature out there that you may have heard of on looking at the performance of mega project construction projects around the world. They typically have huge cost overruns. They're delivered late, and they typically underperform. They don't attract the amount of ridership on rail systems or toll-paying vehicles on highway systems. But in these public-private partnerships, those kinds of risks are transferred. The private sector takes, in exchange for putting equity into the project, the private sector accepts the risk of cost overruns, late completion, and the really big one is the risk of not enough traffic, not enough revenue to pay the debt service on the bonds, particularly to provide the return on investment that the equity providers are hoping for. That's huge. And in these kinds of deals, increasingly, those kinds of risks are being transferred. And we can see this. In fact, this has been proven in the history of these sorts of things. In Australia and the United States, there have been several bankruptcies. I know of 3 in Australia and 3 or 4 in the United States. In none of those cases was there any bailout by taxpayers. So the equity providers lost typically all of their equity in those bankrupt situations. And the debt providers sometimes were able to negotiate a refinancing and strengthen it, lengthen the term still so that they would still potentially recover all of what they initially thought. Sometimes they'd take what's called a haircut and have to accept that they're not going to get all their money back, but the bonds will continue on a revised basis, so forth. Also, the people that invest equity and the bond people look to minimize the life cycle cost. They will often do a more costly design up front that they know is going to be easier to maintain. They're responsible for maintaining it. It's not like the typical construction contractor that builds the thing, walks away, and it's up to the state DOT to deal with the maintenance for the next 50 years or whoever. Okay, and guaranteed long-term maintenance. I mean, the very first thing, I learned this years and years ago in talking to the bond people. You cannot sell a revenue bond for a toll project without covenants in the agreement that are legally enforceable that says you have to have a maintenance reserve, and typically the first money that comes in from the toll payments has to go to make sure the road is properly maintained. Now, there's a good reason for this. If it's like typical California roads and in relatively poor shape, why would people choose to pay toll to use it when they can go on a crappy highway somewhere else? So the bond market has developed this mechanism to require proper maintenance and make sure that that is done that way. And this is carried over to these long-term public-private partnerships because they have the same kind of bond investors. Now, I've looked a lot at the difference between the political incentives that govern highway decision-making in the status quo versus the incentives that operate with these long-term public-private partnerships. First of all, you weed out projects that don't have a return on investment. Or if there's a case where let's say the social benefits are, you add them to the direct economic benefits and you have a positive benefit cost ratio, but you can't finance the social benefits, then typically the state will put in some equity. And so basically the amount that has to be recovered from the toll revenues is enough to do the parts that's the economic benefits, but not the social benefits. And in Texas and Virginia, when they do these long-term agreements and the state puts in some equity, they make a revenue sharing arrangement that says if they agree on the outset, here's the basic model, what we think the most likely stream of revenue is over the 50-year life of the agreement. If it turns out by year 15 or 20 that the revenue is higher, then we're talking about gross revenue, which is easy to measure. You can't hide it in the books. If the gross revenue turns out to be above that line, the amount that it is above gets divvied up between the state DOT and the investors. And the higher it is above the line, the higher the share that goes to the state. So the state has a possibility of recovering a return on that investment, but it's limited because the state is taking no risk on this. The investors are taking all the risk, and so they deserve to have a share of the upside, but so does the state if it's put in equity because of getting the social benefits. Now, the customer-provider relationship is a very important thing that is missing with Caltrans and with the state DOT of any of these states because, and I've talked to people, and there's been actually some research papers on this. When one of these companies designs a project, they look at it a little different. They look at how do we make a design that will get as many users as possible to decide it's worth paying the tolls and therefore increase our revenue. And so in projects in Texas, in Fort Worth and Dallas, there are different on-ramp and off-ramp configurations than what Texas DOT had sketched out in their preliminary designs. Because the company looked at those and said, well, that's going to not be as attractive as it should be to get people to decide to choose to use these express toll lanes. So they changed the design, increased what they spent initially in order to have the additional revenue that they believe will come from doing that. That's a customer-friendly thing to do, to make it easier for people to use the thing. The tolling policy is always negotiated in advance, and the provisions that are agreed on is incorporated in this long-term agreement. There also are provisions for termination and handing back the project, and this can be, the assumption is going to be it's at the end of, if it's a 50-year thing, at the end of 50 years. And the last 5 years are typically there's more stringent inspection requirements. They've got to do this and that and meet these certain quantitative things. But because a 50-year agreement is kind of like a billionaire's prenuptial agreement. You've got a very valuable asset, but you've got two parties, the state and the company, that are going to have to live together and work together for 50 years. And all kinds of things could come up that nobody is sure of right now. So you've got to suppose there's a need for a new interchange 30 years from now. How is that going to be handled? Suppose there's persistent failure on the part of the company to meet certain performance requirements. You put in penalties that are in the agreement, and they still don't respond. There's provisions for termination for cause. That's a very, very serious sanction, believe me. And there's also provisions for termination for convenience. And you have to figure out if the state decides they want to terminate for convenience in year 10 or year 20, how do you deal fairly with the investors that have put a lot of equity in looking at 50 years worth of returns? So you try to figure out in advance. That's why these things are not for $100 million projects. These things are for mega projects, at least the complicated ones. But so these kinds of things that are all built into these many hundred-page prenuptial agreements, let's say, are the alternative to a state regulatory commission that is often motivated partly by political reasons to play the populist and bang on the company. This is, I think, a more sophisticated and civilized way to deal with the regulatory problem, and it's the model that's been adopted all around the world and is incorporated in the 7 or 8 states that so far have these kinds of projects in operation. Now, I mentioned the risk. And I've said there's been no bailouts so far in either Australia or the United States in the few cases we've seen of bankruptcy. This is a little table that if anybody would like a copy of the presentation, I authorize USC to share this with anybody who wants it. These are the biggest projects in the last 15 years, and there's $36 billion of investment in these projects. Now, that's a big number in some senses, but in terms of total highway spending in the United States, it's a very small fraction. But it's a good start, and it suggests there's a lot of potential for more of this if the ideas get some. I'll give you just a few little examples, the only pictures in the presentation. Examples of so-called impossible problems for dealing with congestion and so forth. Here's a case of adding capacity to a toll road in Tampa that gets suburban commuters to downtown Tampa. So it's basically inbound in the morning, outbound in the afternoon. They didn't want to have a big fight to acquire right-of-way on either side, so they came up with this idea of 3 reversible express lanes built on 6-foot wide pillars in the median, and they call it 6 lanes on 6 feet because it's the functional equivalent of 6 lanes because nobody would be using the other direction lanes in the morning, hardly anybody. Very cost-effective project, and this could be done many, many more places than it has been so far. This is in Melbourne, Australia. My wife, Lou, who's in the back, and I drove this in 2000, a couple of years after it opened. It's to the left of the picture, there's a high-rise residential building, and the company, this is partly elevated and partly tunnels in Melbourne. They built the sound wall there in very artistic fashion partly for PR, but partly to shield the residential building from the noise exposure of an elevated expressway going past where there hadn't been one before. And then there's a favorite thing. This is the A86 ring road around Paris, and the dotted line, the vertical line there is a missing link that was there, like the missing link on the Long Beach Freeway through South Pasadena. Held up for the same kind of reason. Nobody wanted their community bisected by this massive roadway. In there is Versailles, where the palace is, and the historic. So you can understand why for 40 years nobody wanted to complete this thing. One of these private French toll road companies made an unsolicited proposal to the French government in the late 1990s. Said, if you will give us, negotiate a long-term concession for us, we will develop this as a deep bore tunnel using a tunnel boring machine way underneath that whole area. That's like 6 miles total, including an interchange with that A13 highway that's all underground. And we will do this at our expense and finance it with the toll revenue, variable tolls. But, he said, in order to make it affordable, we have to do it like this, double deck, with the height of 2.55 meters, which is basically parking structure clearances. So no big trucks would be allowed. French government negotiated and thought and finally agreed. And the concession was the company would have to build an alternate 2-lane tunnel for trucks on a different alignment outside of the Versailles area. And so they eventually did that as a second phase. But this is how they did it. This is me and a guy from Coffee Route on the upper deck. You can see it does not look that claustrophobic. And this was about 6 months before it opened. It was finished, but they hadn't done all the safety and emergency evacuation tests and so forth. This has been a huge success. It closed that missing link, and the company seems to be making money on it. It opened about 2005, I think. Now, where does the money come from? Basically, the equity investment comes from 2 primary sources. There's a phenomenon called global infrastructure investment funds that started about 15 years ago. These raise money from sophisticated investors to invest in infrastructure of all kinds, but investor-owned infrastructure, because that's what you can invest equity. You can't invest equity in LAX or the Department of Water and Power, but you can invest equity in these privately financed projects. And pension funds. U.S. pension funds like CalPERS and all of them basically are grossly underfunded. They have large unfunded liabilities, and they have been trying to diversify their portfolios into alternative investments. CalPERS is now aiming for 5% of its portfolio to be invested in infrastructure. They started out, because there's hardly any project in the United States, investing in privatized Gatwick Airport, London Gatwick Airport, and things like that. And they now have started investing in the P3, public-private partnership infrastructure. And I think this is a huge, important development. And then, of course, the debt markets, the bond markets, revenue bond markets are the debt provider, main debt providers. Banks sometimes provide short-term construction financing, but then taken out by long-term toll revenue bonds. And tolls are the basic revenue stream. There's some other ways of doing this, but the only way to get new revenue into this is to use tolls for these projects. When I go to transportation conferences, as I'm sure if you've been to some, all the weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth is, there's not enough money, there's no money, blah, blah, blah. When I go to infrastructure investment conferences, it's exactly the opposite. They're sitting on tons and tons of money. Where are the projects? There's not enough, particularly in the United States. Where are the projects? We're investing in Colombia, but there's big political risk in Colombia. We'd love to invest more in the United States, but there's hardly any projects. So the global infrastructure funds, these are some numbers. They've raised over nearly $500 billion for infrastructure. Now, this is on a global basis, all kinds of infrastructure, energy, water, railroads, pipelines, et cetera, and highways and bridges. That would finance, given typical equity being about a quarter of the total, almost $2 trillion worth of infrastructure. And the United States ought to be getting a decent share of that if we had the projects. So my thought in closing the book is, how could we begin the transition to the highway utility model? And I think, well, you've got to have, one thing we need to do, and there's a growing consensus in the transportation community that we cannot rely on per gallon fuel taxes on the long term, because we're changing propulsion. Electric vehicles probably are going to become affordable, and for good environmental reasons we want to do that. Well, you don't have any per gallon taxes with electric vehicles or a lot of other other alternative propulsion. So we need to switch, and I was on the TRB committee that originally identified this need, and there was a subsequent Infrastructure Financing Commission that my colleague Adrian Moore was on, and they said mileage-based user fees, per mile charges, different for different, heavy trucks would pay a lot more than cars and so forth. But that's the best. They weighed 16 or 18 alternatives to come up. That's the best, and I agree with that. So that's one reason to try to change the model. And the other is we have a huge problem with the interstate highway system that is reaching the end of its useful life. The program was authorized in 1956. The large majority of the projects were finished by early 1970, except for a handful like the 105 here in Southern California. But they were typically designed, if well maintained, with a 50-year design life. And that's creeping up. It's passed already on some facilities. I-70 across the middle of the country is one of the first ones to open its pavement. It's completely, they can keep patching it up, but it needs to have the whole pavement pulled up, the subbed replaced, and all new, and it needs more lanes, it needs dedicated truck lanes, so forth. So my transition thing is to start with the need to rebuild and modernize the interstates for the 21st century, and the transition we need to make from per gallon to per mile. Put those things together and have toll-financed interstate reconstruction as the starting point for the transition to highway utilities. And that gives a project a big investment need. The study that I did at Reason Foundation about 4 years ago estimated the net present value of doing this for the entire interstate system over a 25-year period was just about $1 trillion. There is no identified funding source in federal or state governments for anything like a project of that magnitude. On the other hand, our study, which was done on a state-by-state basis, found that 45 of the 50 states looked to be toll feasible with the actual interstates that they have, their different ages and conditions, and the traffic levels that are current and the forecast traffic levels from the DOT's Volpe Center in Cambridge, Mass, across the street from MIT. We also built in dedicated truck lanes on the key corridors that are forecast by Federal Highway Administration to have 40% or more of their total vehicle miles of travel being heavy trucks within the next decade or two. And that would be huge from a customer standpoint. The trucking industry would benefit, and all of us driving on those highways with these huge big rigs, especially when they start platooning in 3 or 4 platoons of 18-wheelers, we're going to be so glad those are in separate barrier-separated lanes and not mixing with us. Commercial service plazas. Did you realize that all toll roads in America have commercial service plazas where you can buy, sit down to have a meal, buy takeout food, get gas, buy souvenirs, blah, blah, blah. That's illegal by federal law on all interstate highways, except the ones with tolls that were grandfathered into the system. Why? Because the truck stop industry didn't want the competition. They like all these places concentrated around the on-ramps and off-ramps, and they've kept that in place, lobbying every time people bring it up in Congress. But that's an outrage. I mean, people driving on long, including truckers, who are going to need electric recharging. Consumers and truckers are going to need electric recharging stations. Nobody's going to give away the recharging for free. That's a commercial service. Shouldn't it be right on the interstate in a service plaza where you can do it conveniently? And if it takes a half hour or 45 minutes to recharge, you can have sit down at a few steps away is a nice restaurant for you to eat at. Anyway, this is crazy. And it's an example of politics driving what should be sensible economic decision. Any commercial toll road provider would provide service plazas like that to serve its customers. Give me a break. It's so obvious. And then the second step, I propose the long-distance interstates first, because that's easier to do. But then revamping the freeways, and we're making a start. This region and about a dozen others have, in the long-range plans now, whole networks of express toll lanes to provide a relief valve from congestion using variable pricing to do it. And that's a good start. Ultimately, we're going to need peak and off-peak prices on the regular lanes too, but there's good economic evidence for two-tier pricing. You've got, the demand curve has long tails, and on any given day, the people with the very high-end value of time might be different today from yesterday, because today they're going to the airport for an important flight, or they've got a really important meeting, and so they'll pay anything to bypass the congestion. Other days, they're sort of maybe in the median. And other people are always going to be down at the low end. And so you want to have an affordable peak price that gives people a reason to think, should I carpool? Should I take the express bus that uses the express lanes? That's an important thing, and it provides some revenue source for the rebuilding. There's going to be lots and lots of revenue coming from the express toll lanes, charging the premium prices. So we're going to be able to rebuild the urban interstates if we do the whole thing with pricing. And we can do that in a humane way. Now, the Trump infrastructure proposal, as it was drafted, which may not ever see the light of day, had some useful ideas on this. It included some incentives for states to use these long-term P3s, public-private partnership mechanisms, that makes it easier, provided a way, it made the applicability of tax-exempt revenue bonds more widely applicable, including to rebuild existing projects, not just to build new things. And it would remove the federal ban on using tolls on interstates and the federal ban on commercial rest areas. So it means bits and pieces of these things, if there's eventually an infrastructure bill next year, which people are now talking about again, getting a few of those little things in there could have a huge impact on moving the direction that we need to go. So to sum up, why highways utilities may happen. First three, the status quo cannot continue. Stein's law, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop eventually. But the looming insolvency of the federal government means that the practice we've had for the last decade of every year general fund money getting put into the highway trust fund because there's not enough fuel to, that's going to be history before very long, because there's just not going to be anything, there's not going to be general fund money. It's all going to go on entitlements, defense, and interest on the national debt. Look at the CBO's projections over the next decade, just the next decade alone. The states have not much flexibility to have a big ramp up in spending on highways, partly because of the fading of the fuel tax, but also because if they have spare change, shoring up their ailing pension funds has got to be job number one, responsibility number one. So we've got some, and the fuel tax problem is general and it affects all states. So those are the negatives that say the status quo is not an option. The positive factors are, first, people are becoming more and more aware that this global model that's in Latin America, Europe, Australia, and even in parts of Asia, the Philippines have some, Indonesia have some, Malaysia has some, China has some in a kind of state-owned enterprise form. The track record is good and getting better all the time. The global infrastructure investment funds really are going to start, I think, being more vocal about the need for more U.S. projects to invest in and the advantages of doing that. And I think the sleeper in this is the U.S. pension funds. CalPERS, CalSTRS, and those guys, when the Indiana Toll Road was refinanced, this was a private concession for 75 years, and the initial provider was hugely over-leveraged and didn't take account of a big recession, which devastated their truck toll revenue. They filed Chapter 11, so the state put it out to bid. A consortium of public sector pension funds bid more than the original firms had bid. $3.6 billion was the original upfront 75-year lease payment. The buyout was $5.7 billion because the pension funds did a very conservative financing. They put in almost 50% equity. So they only had to finance out of toll revenue half of that cost. And they got, the Australian firm that put the deal together got 70 U.S. public sector pension funds to take pieces of it. So they are now all invested in the Indiana Toll Road long-term P3 concession. And after a year, CalPERS, the biggest pension fund in the country, came to them and said, can we buy 10% of this? And they worked out the deal, and CalPERS bought 10% of the Indiana Toll Road. So if this gets going, if the pension funds become more vocal about, we need more projects to invest in the United States, this could make the politics of it, I think, a little easier. So I don't know if we want to talk about this, but I'm sure I'll get questions. So let me just quickly say, and then we'll be done. What about these new technologies, things? How is that going to affect this future scenario? First, electric vehicles, I think, are coming definitely. I think they're the superior technology for a lot of reasons. It's probably going to take longer than most people are hoping and expecting. But this is going to hasten the need to transition from per gallon to per mile charges. So that's good for my vision. And the faster it happens, the better. Connected vehicles, some people keep saying CAV, connected autonomous vehicles. We talk to the researchers doing autonomous vehicles. There's no necessary connection with connected and autonomous. The intelligence needs to be in the vehicle and the sensing systems to be able to navigate any roads. Now, there's some ancillary benefits if they're also connected. And for example, CACC is Cooperative Adaptive Cruise Control, which is available on some cars now. It's a form of connection where the vehicles talk to each other. This is the key to truck platooning, by the way, and it's being already in testing on actual highways. So it's a low form of automation, but it's enabled by the connectivity between vehicles. But it's not in general an essential part of autonomous vehicles. But studies have been shown, simulations have been shown that on congested freeways, if most of the vehicles have CACC capability, then they can operate, you can have a higher density of vehicles still moving without congestion. And that means we won't have to expand freeways. If it comes soon, we won't have to expand the freeway capacity as much as we otherwise would to cope with congestion. Does not reduce the need for express toll lanes for those premium trips because you still need to have those to satisfy that portion of the demand. But I think it's going to be very important for truck platooning and increasing the productivity of trucking. Autonomous vehicles, here's where there's a growing amount of learning going on. And what you read in Sunday supplements and a lot of blogs about, oh, this is going to be in 10 years, this is going to be all autonomous and blah, blah, blah. That's talking about level 5 when you don't have a steering wheel and don't have driver controls and they can handle any roads, any weather conditions, so forth. most of the thinking is now that's probably not likely until 2035 to actually be on the market. And then if it turns out to be popular and affordable, then the typical fleet turnover is about 20 years to replace almost all the existing vehicle fleet. So unless it's much faster than that for level 5 AVs, you're talking about 2050 or so before you have a mostly autonomous fleet. And a lot of the benefits will come when most of the fleet is that way. Another thing is 5 years ago, most of the people doing this, when they looked at the implications for highways and transportation, they said, well, we're probably going to have less vehicle miles of travel than are in the conventional forecasts. It's switched over to now most of the research think that it's going to be a lot more VMT than in conventional forecasts for several different reasons. And one of the big ones, KPMG's study, looked at the trips that will likely be made in robo-taxis by people who can't drive today. Too young, too old, or too disabled. And that they project that factor alone will mean VMT by 2050 would be 5 trillion compared to 3 trillion today. Now there's some offsetting factors on that, but we'll see. But there's very little thought today in the research community that it will be less VMT than our conventional forecasts say. But nobody can really figure out exactly, because there's too many variables to how soon this happens, how soon that happens, and so forth. Shared mobility, mobility as a service, the idea that hardly anybody will want to own a vehicle once robotaxis are out there. You'll have equivalent mobility without the ownership of a vehicle. It turns out that some of the simulation studies that have been done make, I think, unwarranted assumptions that this would be equivalent to the same flexibility you have in your cars. And some researchers are now looking at all the different kinds of cases where people would not find the same level of convenience and mobility. For example, trip chaining during commutes. People stopping and make personal errands, picking up kids from daycare and so forth. It's hard to do that in a shared situation where the other people with you don't feel disadvantaged. You don't feel disadvantaged by when they're stopping for dry cleaning and so forth. That just doesn't seem to work. And there's a whole bunch of other things like that I list them in the book. But so to conclude, and I'm happy to, as we have time for questions, my conclusions are that, first of all, that our major highways the system that we have is failing. The institutions are failing, the funding mechanism is failing, and we really need to think hard about replacing it with something better. I think the model that we've been used historically for utilities, for all the other utilities, whether they're investor-owned or government-owned, has so many advantages that I think we should really think hard about how to take that model and adapt the highway system to it. And that's what I've tried to lay out in at least a starting way in the book. And I think we have key ingredients that are going to make this that we need to have. We have per mile charging by all electronic tolling. That's been a breakthrough, and it facilitates this, certainly on limited access highways, which is the main focus of the book. The long-term P3, public-private partnership model, has growing track record and a lot of learning. Not everything has been a success, but we've learned a whole lot about how to structure these agreements, and the benefits are really proving out. We have companies, global companies, including some U.S. companies that are getting up to speed on this with track records. And we have willing investors with gobs of money out there that would love to finance these kinds of things. So I think what we need to do is, and the reason I wrote the book was to try to get this idea into circulation, have people start thinking about it, discussing it, writing papers about it, so that we could see, can we have this conversation and maybe get there someday. And the book, there's a flyer here that from the University of Chicago Press, the publisher. You could have it. The order form on the back gives you a 20% discount if you order directly from them. It's available on Amazon. There's also a Kindle edition. That's the end of the commercial. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you got something out of this.